Starting now.
Okay.
And as folks trickle in, welcome. Happy Friday. It is very much springtime here in Chicago, so we're very happy about that.
Yeah,
Um, Go ahead and start sharing my screen, and then we'll get into it.
cool.
All right. Jules, I think I see you in the crowd. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see everything? Jules? Yes. Thank you. You're my reliable go-to. Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for joining. We're going to go ahead and get things kicked off here. Very excited about what I'll call a version of a special edition of our Podchaser Pro webinar series. Today, we are joined by Daniel at Semafor. Daniel is the Director of Audience Development over there. And we wanted to talk to Daniel for one very specific reason, and that is for the first time in the since December 2024, so it's about 16 months, we had a pure play business podcast, Crack the Podchaser 25. For those that aren't aware of what Podchaser 25 is, it is our monthly compilation of looking at all of the podcasts that have launched their first episode within the last 90 days. We rank those, we stack rank them, we look at things like power score, reach, some audience insights and demographics as well. And then we stack rank all of these shows against each other to identify what are the breakout hits on an ongoing basis. So that is why we're here today. Normally, we talk a little bit more so on the earned media side of things or even paid media. But when it comes to audience development, especially for podcast networks and or publishers, this is kind of a behind the scenes role. And Daniel, feel free to correct my perspective on audience development. But when I think about audience development, I really think about it as how we're marketing a piece of media, and that could be a show, that could be a play. So think about Broadway. That could be a podcast, which obviously we're going to talk about today, but that could also be marketing a newsletter. So think about it as the media entity really being the product versus, myself. I'm in charge of marketing Podchaser as a product, as a data source, et cetera. And I think that's kind of a simple framing to have in the back of our minds as we shape up this conversation. So without further ado, I will introduce Daniel here from Semafor. I guess first and foremost, Daniel, how'd I do on my layman's definition of audience development?
I think it's great, and I think this is maybe the one time I will come out from my cave to speak on audience development. You're right in that we want the show to kind of shine light, and there are a lot of different ways to do it, but like we have a lot of helping hands at Semaphore with audience development and like working especially with the host, it's been really easy to do a lot of things to build the community around the show.
Excellent, excellent. So we'll get into a lot of the soups and the nuts, the tactics and strategies here in a bit. But I just want to take a little bit of time as we kick things off here to um, frame up like how rare this is that we've had a business podcast at the Podchaser 25. And if you read some of the promotional assets as we put out leading up to the event, you might have noticed that I called it a pure play business podcast. I'm calling it that because, Semaphore as a publisher, they are a pure play publisher and they're producing business content specifically when it comes to compound interest. That doesn't necessarily mean we haven't had other variants of business type podcasts on before, on the Podchaser 25 before. In fact, the most notable one would be the founder of Skims or co-founder of Skims, not Kim Kardashian, but her business partner. And while that is technically classified as a business podcast, uh, it's not necessarily a journalistically credible one in kind of like the traditional sense. So their show is a lot more influencer driven, which we can make a very strong case that the creator economy is as real of a business as any. However, knowing where we see a lot of our Podchaser 25 entrants coming on as celebrities, influencers, these types of things, I don't necessarily classify it as a pure business podcast versus compound interest. I very much do. So that is one little editorial kind of point of clarification for everybody here too. Now, it's when we start talking about the business podcast landscape, everyone has probably seen the statistics of most podcasts don't get past episode 6. There's a lot of reasons for that. There's actually a term for it called pod fade, which we all have probably been exposed to at some point in time. So again, to frame up how rare it is for us to have a business podcast at the Podchaser 25 list, I went back and I looked at the number of business podcasts that were launched from that point in time of the last one that we had on, which was the best idea yet, which was effectively can think of it as like a spinoff of the best one yet, T-Boy for the fan boys and gals and people in the room. And again, just to put some numbers to this, there were 56,000 business podcasts launched in the business category since that time period. About 20,000 of them are still active, meaning they've released an episode within the last 60 days. And when we distill that down, only about 35% of shows that launched in that same time horizon are still active. And when we think about this in the grander scheme of things, I'd like to boil it down to something quite simple, and it's that podcasting is hard, and it's not purely just about the content, but it's about distribution, which is a bit of a little tease for what we're going to get into here in a bit. And now to talk about compound interest specifically, it debuted at number 8 on the Podchaser 25 list. It had a power score of 73, and that meant it's right around like highly visible pop culture, sports, true crime types of shows. In fact, I believe you guys were sandwiched right in between a new true crime podcast and an F1 podcast. When we think about the global scale of true crime as a category and F1 as a category, it's quite a spectacle to behold that a pure play business podcast could rub shoulders there. So pure business from a standing start. Daniel, any questions, comments, chime-ins so far?
I guess in the outside of the business category, do you find news commentary making the list
We
quite a bit?
do, yeah.
Okay.
So news commentary definitely is up there. Specifically, I'm thinking about in the Q1 analysis that we did. There are some flagship types of news shows. There's one from who's the group? The Goalhanger Podcast Network, which is based in the UK. They've been releasing more and more news commentary shows, some with, even though they're UK based, US specific interests. That's been an interesting one to take a look at. Anytime you get a notable journalist that's transitioning from what I'll call, traditional corporate mainstream media, so I think of like your CNNs, CNBCs, MSNBCs of the world, and then they move to more independent journalism route. Oftentimes, we're seeing those independent journalists also starting to crack
Did
the Podchaser 25, but there's a lot of reasons for that.
I know Joanna Stern just left and started her own independent outlet. Do you know it was her show on the list? Or
I'd have to double
okay,
back and check, but that's a
okay.
good question. Yeah, I know excuse me, a CNN host in February cracked the top 25 for the first time. And she was uh effusive in her praise, and I think it offered her some initial validation that she made the right route to go
Good
independent.
deal.
So, so cool. Now I want to make you the star of the show here a little bit more so, Daniel. When we think about the origin story of compound interest, obviously Semafor has a high level of journalistic integrity, journalistic standards, that sort of thing. You probably have a deep roster of reporters and journalists you can pull from. I guess first and foremost, what was the concept like? How did this really come to fruition, specifically from just the concept of compound interest? And we'll get into the host here in a second.
Yeah, I think just to start, maybe I'm going to take a step back and kind of explain the origin of Semafor and
Yeah,
just like what got us to these shows. But we were founded a little over 4 years ago in 2022, and we're one of the world's fastest growing independent media companies. We look to deliver intelligence through our live reporting and our live convenings that we have. We just had a big event in Washington, D.C. last month called Semafor World Economy. But our journalists really look to cover the biggest stories shaping business, politics, and the global economy. And we do that through mainly three ways. So one is our email briefings. Semafor has 12 owned and operated email briefings from covering Silicon Valley to Wall Street to DC. We have one covering Sub-Saharan Africa, the Gulf, and most recently we launched Semafor China. But in the past few years, we've started expanding into the show format, and we launched our first one in 2024 called Mixed Signals from Semafor Media. And this year we added two shows in March. One is the CEO Signal, and the other is what we're talking about today, compound interest. So to go back to the question of like, I think why we launched the podcast or what was the story behind it. I think that right now in business, there is a story that there is like the financialization of everything like around us. Like you can bet on elections, you can finance a sushi order in four payments. So I think what Liz and Rohan and like they had been covering this in their newsletter. They write a twice weekly email briefing called Semafor Business. Um, is really looking at that question and then talking to the people in charge of those companies or who have been in those institutions for many years and understanding like how they are shaping those companies and the broader economy in general. Um, right now, we've had a lot of founders and CEOs on, but I think they're looking for just like a deeper conversation of unpacking what the companies are doing and how it's disrupting economic forces, what the financial incentives are, and like what market experiments are driving those decisions. So that was kind of, I think, the thesis with us launching the show. And we've had a lot of, I guess, asset classes that I didn't know about. Like this week, we had on Chris Bogart of Buford Capital, and they focus on litigation as an asset class, which I didn't know that you could pull money into lawsuits and make money off of it. I thought it was just losing money. So it's been interesting to be along for the ride and see who they're talking to and what our audience finds interesting.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about the guest selection process, how you frame up what a good guest looks like, and these types of things. But I'm glad that you've already identified some of these disruption stories because even if we look at this mosaic of folks that have been on the show already, that is a pretty clear signal. So that's great. Now, when it comes to Liz and Rohan specifically, obviously they're colleagues, they work together. How did that process materialize from, hey, do you guys want to host a podcast to, is there internal politicking that's involved without giving away, any trade secrets?
I don't necessarily think there's internal politicking. I will say anytime I talk with Liz and Rohan, I am dumbfounded by like how much I don't know, both in like two different areas, but like their dynamic is a big part of the show, right? Like
Yeah.
they write this twice weekly briefing together, and I found that like in their writing and then when they're recording the show, they're able to move between like curiosity, skepticism, analysis in real time, and it creates, I think, conversations and written pieces that are both smart and generally conversational. Um, the two host format we saw success with Mixed Signals as well. That's hosted by our editor-in-chief Ben Smith and our media editor Max Tawney. And our other show, the CEO Signal, has Andrew Edgecliffe Johnson, our CEO editor, and then Penny Pritzker, who's the former Secretary of Commerce. So I think just having two people with a bit different experience coming together and approaching a guest or a topic from two different angles definitely helps. Liz had covered Wall Street prior to Semafor for nearly a decade and focused a lot on M&A, I believe, and Rohan's coming from CNBC with focusing on investor activism. So they're able to talk about a topic in a few different ways, and I can give an example. We had Ben Lamb on, who is the CEO of Colossal. For anyone who doesn't know, Colossal is the company that like brought Tom Brady's dead dog back to life. Like they focus on de-extinction as their product. And Liz was asking Ben, like, what is the total addressable market, or like what is the like value of de-extinction. And I think he threw out a number that was over $1 trillion. And in that, Rohan quickly has jumped in and been like, what do you mean? Like, how are you valuing in this? Or like, who's pricing this? Like, is it Wall Street? Is it consulting firms? And I think when they're asking some of these questions, they can just piggyback off of each other and like really dive in a layer deeper than like having just one host on.
And I assume that as an audience development professional, having two different angles from which you're attacking most conversations lends itself quite well to marketing, promoting, and distributing the show. Is that a proper assumption?
Yeah, like if I'm ever having trouble when we're like getting ready to do some audience development, I can always go to them and like they're really good at figuring out like if there's a specific niche in the audience or like who would be interested in the episode. Uh, they will provide some guidance. So like um, Rohan, like when we had Chris Bogart on last week, like would be able to point me in the direction of like w- uh like bigger law firms or like areas that may find this interesting so that if we're marketing it out I can look to send the show their way and hopefully get some new people to listen.
Yeah, and speaking of that, I do want to start to go a little bit deeper into some of the distribution and marketing and promotion side of this, because again, to have this outsized early growth is something to behold. Now, before we started actually recording and before folks started trickling in, we talked a little bit about Semafor's width and breadth from a publishing perspective, certainly with newsletters and that sort of thing. Talking directly about newsletters and maybe getting into some of the collaboration and partnerships that we started to discuss. Is there an overall structure that you approach audience development from? Because again, we're looking at you as in a bowl full of blue M&Ms. You are the red M&M that's standing out, certainly within the business podcast landscape.
Yeah, I think to start you do need to have a lot of internal competence and people willing to jump in and really make sure if you have an owned and operated audience you're able to like get the new product out there and really market it to them. So I think for Semafor, obviously, like I mentioned, we have 12 email briefings, and that has been a huge lever for us where week over week we can identify based on the guest, like who would be interested in hearing about this and listening to a compound interest. I think that like at this point, probably most of people who subscribe to Semafor are have seen a compound interest promotion, but like when we have on specific guests, we had on John Arnold, who is of his time like a very prolific energy trader. So for us, like we have a Semafor energy newsletter that's like a hand in glove fit of we should be promoting to this audience and getting them to check it out. This is a name they probably know. They're reading about energy. They're interested in it. And I will just plug, if you don't read Semaphore Energy, you should. Tim McDonald is a fantastic journalist and does great work. But uh, I think the internal promotion is a big part. And then kind of jumping into like other levers that we pull. One thing that has been helpful is building a community of other podcast and like media publishers to work with. So one thing I really enjoy about my job is just how friendly both those communities are and like willing to work with each other and lift up each other's journalism or like new products that they have. So we have a pretty robust partnership network where we will leverage some of Semafor's like newsletters, and in return they'll promote a Semafor product, whether that be compound interest, um, like a new newsletter like Semafor China, and we do that where it's a cross promotion of sorts. So in a newsletter for Semafor, we would promote them, say 30 to 50 words about their newsletter or their podcast, give a call to action with a link where our audience can go check it out, and then we would ask them to do the same. So it's fair trade. The hope is that we're both getting eyeballs to each other's pages, and like we can continue doing that on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, and for those that have joined us for previous webinars, thinking about our conversation with Joni Deutsch from the Podglomerate, obviously
Oh,
spent a bulk of
Joni's
her,
great.
she's amazing. We
Yeah.
love her. She spent a lot of her career at NPR, and she's talking about, NPR, you think about this big behemoth news organization, and then they also have segmentation within each of the news types that they cover. But even going outside of that and working with partner publishers, where it makes sense to have, what we call like this trade-off or these like co-opted types of initiatives and partnerships, it makes a huge difference when it comes to distribution and getting the right eyeballs on the right pieces of content. So I'm glad you brought that up. We've also had other guests like Lauren Pissell from Tink Media talking about doing this exact same thing, not just with podcasts and guest swaps and cross promos, but even looking at newsletters, social media activations, that sort of thing. So we will touch a little bit on social media here in a bit, but I do want to double back on one thing. So I think one working hypothesis that we have as to why business podcasts don't seem to grow nearly in the same way as a true crime or an F1 or whatever category we want to throw in there is oftentimes the premise of a business podcast is we're going to talk about sales or we're going to talk about marketing or we're going to talk about business. And while that does offer you a very large surface area to go, cast your nets towards, oftentimes there's a dilution of the content and you just don't have the same level of depth. Certainly expertise. You start talking about things you might be actually learning about as opposed to positioning yourself as an expert in. So one of my questions to you, Daniel, would be obviously Semafor is playing, with a foot on third base, if you will. You've done the due diligence, you've built up all these audiences, and now you can selectively market to specific segments that subscribe to other types of content that you provide. And then comparing that to kind of the generalist business podcast that never really gets that level of traction. They try to be everything or try to be something to everyone. Um, the initial thesis behind Semafor, was it to build a broad-based business audience? Did it start narrow and then you started to verticalize from there? Looking at this from the lens of, what kind of practical advice for these burgeoning media and content uh, individuals and or media teams, what's the right approach? Is it start wide and narrow in, or is it start narrow and then kind of offer complementary content from there?
You know, I think we were pretty diligent on doing some audience mapping before like compound interest going out of who we think is going to benefit and enjoy the show. And we try to do that because we want the show to be reaching people who are working in that space or making decisions day to day on just like their own business. So I think we were pretty intentional about what audience we think would like the show. That being said, when you are launching a new show, I do think that you need to have the understanding that you may need to cast a wide net and not every fish is going to get um, in the I can't in the net.
Hmm.
Um, like I, I do think that there will be people that drop off from a show like that it won't be a fit for them, and that's okay. But I think to be very narrow to start is probably it's good to map things out, but it's okay to start broad and kind of work your way down, especially as more and more episodes are being produced and you're able to identify like new audiences through some of those episodes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
perfect. Let's get into some of the content itself, and some of that content obviously is going to be guest driven, but I've just plucked, six folks that I'm familiar with and working in tech and SaaS, generally speaking, as well as being a consumer of a lot of business content. And when we look at some of these guests, obviously they've accomplished some pretty incredible business feats, whether that's Mark from Wonder, Mark Cuban, of course, maybe America's most known
Yeah.
investor in a lot of ways. Aura, Colossal, which we already referenced as well. And you gave the example of Tom Brady, but I remember when I first saw new startup company de-extinct woolly mammoth, I thought,
Yeah.
what timeline am I living in? So, I think that's an interesting one. Andreessen Horowitz, of course, has representation, and then a Built as well, which is another interesting story in that it's kind of a reclamation project, a rehabilitation project in some
Yeah.
ways as well. But when you look at this, again, we're looking at supremely notable figures, well-known brands, interesting storylines that are kind of connecting this all through. And one of the most interesting storylines is going to be disruption. So, I mean, specifically, you could look at Mark Cuban trying to disrupt the drug market for greater accessibility. Think about Aura. I mean, Aura and wearable devices, whether it's them or Whoop or any other the new Google Fitbit that's only $99, it's now aimed to disrupt the market that Aura disrupted. When you think about these big seismic moments that happen in kind of that intersection of what I'll call technology, business, and then culture, is that kind of the central thesis around identifying who can support that best from their own lived experiences and parlaying those stories into really incredible content in the podcast format under the compound interest umbrella.
Yeah, I think so. I think like obviously all of these people on screen have had previous helms at other companies like Mark Cuban, previous owner of the Dallas Mavericks. Mark Lore had sold a few companies. But I do think that what the general like question we're getting around or people that we want to be having on the show is we're interested in people who are changing the current economy. And at this current moment, I don't think I could walk down the street without seeing an Oura Ring or a Fitbit of sorts. Um, and I think it's over time, like less about title and more about the influence that they currently have on shaping markets, capital, and the way business gets done. From an audience development perspective, the guests are a big driver on how we can get people to discover compound interest. So I can't really take credit for my work on audience development with booking a lot of these guests. Obviously, Liz and Rohan are seasoned reporters. They've talked with these people. I know they've talked with a few of them on stage at Semafor events, interviewing them. Um, but I think it's very helpful with their ability to book a lot of these people for me to then go out and pitch and try to get some earned media around it. And I think we'll continue to see like this theme of bringing on people who are disrupting what's going on in the current moment.
Yeah, and I think there's disruption, right, as kind of the central thesis, but that there's different scales of disruption, right? And because we serve a very interesting use case for a lot of our clients, and that they want to get their clients as guests on podcasts, and
Yeah.
oftentimes they're representing very well-known, very interesting types of people with some notable companies and backgrounds, but also it goes, further down the line from there. It seems like you guys have a different definition of disruption, and I think that might be part of the differentiator of this show. I guess when it comes to disruption, like anybody can say that they're an innovator, a disruptor, et cetera. There are very few that actually do it. I know you had Dara on. I didn't put Dara on this slide, but when you think about Uber, of course, Uber is completely disrupted everything. But there's a scale to the disruption economy, and I think that is maybe one of the things that makes this quite special. These are folks that have probably in every VC meeting that they sat in on, every investor call that they had, there was a not insignificant amount of people who thought they were just crazy that they would take on and tackle these types of markets. But folks like guests on Compound Interest have. Could that alone be a differentiator for a business podcast as opposed to somebody who is starting a company, scaling it, achieving certain levels of greatness? I mean, I think from my perspective, it is a big differentiator, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, I think that definitely is a differentiator, and I think we see shows that focus around that aspect of a lot of founders and their like first venture and exiting. Like My First Million, it's a fantastic show from HubSpot that kind of centers around that. Um, but it's not to sound like a broken record, but like we are very focused on like, yes, these people they've been in these rooms, they've had previous experience, but we want to understand the why and now, just because I think our audience is looking for those insights. They're very business oriented, and Semafor as a whole is looking to provide like transparent and intelligent conversations. And um, I just think that the guest caliber that we're trying to hit is maybe a little bit different than the like My First Million or First Exit arena. That being said, I think the positioning that like if you're pitching out guests is just like where does the person I'm pitching fit in this current moment, and what is the field that they can provide the most expertise on will go a long way. Because a lot of shows like ours are trying to just define what's going on right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a process to defining what's going on right now? I mean, I hear from major PR agencies, Madison Avenue PR agencies all the time. Why don't podcasts publish some sort of editorial calendar so we can know what types of ideas, what types of stories, what types of themes they're looking for? And I said, well, because it doesn't quite work like that. I'm
Yeah.
curious, is there any sort of process that you guys deploy through the show, again, without giving away any secret sauce, about identifying what is current, what is trending, what does deserve a deeper dive into understanding what's happening and shaping this?
I'm a little bit farther away on like week to week who we're having, but it I think if you're just looking around like at what's kind of going on, or like when I talk with Liz and Rohan, they're very up to tune on like what Wall Street is talking about, what the general consumer is talking about. And I think that their conversations that they're having with like sources or um, just like our colleagues in the newsroom is shaping how they're going about booking guests and who's coming on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Because there is so much noise now, right? And
Yeah.
things are changing so quickly, especially if you're exposed to any of the AI commentary and such. But even from, macroeconomic perspectives, geopolitical perspectives, zeroing in on what matters most, not just to everybody, but to these, what I define as like highly curious business audiences. I'm sure that there is some
Yeah.
secret sauce that if you were locked in a room for a while, you'd be able to pluck out.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting one because I feel like so often, especially with business podcasts, it's somewhat reactionary, right? So they see the headline in the Wall Street Journal or in their favorite newsletter, and then the hosts are effectively editorializing a version of the editorial. But you guys take a little bit different approach, and I think that's quite refreshing.
Yeah. On the signal to noise
Yeah.
thing, just one thing that our newsroom has done recently is we had this big conference last month. I think there were over 300 people on stage, 250 sessions. Our newsroom had helped with our head of data develop a tool checking transcription from all of those conversations and like heat mapping common themes of what was going on, and brought together what it's called Semafor intelligence, but just like takeaways.
Mm.
And obviously AI was maybe the biggest heat map, but I think that was really interesting because our newsroom was able to take it back and then use it in other places of like where people are currently, I guess, what people are currently thinking about in the business world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was thinking about this the other day. Someone in my network had shared something about Cloudflare, and with all this talk about AEO, GEO, SEO, we saw the CEO of Condé Nast has issued an edict to his editorial team saying like, don't worry about page views anymore. That's not where we're going to show up. And then this individual that posted about Cloudflare posited that Cloudflare might be the best source for understanding what's happening in Google search, botted search, these types of things. And then you actually go and you look and you see that at South by Southwest, Cloudflare's CEO gave a fireside chat, and it's on YouTube, it's on the podcast. I think it was on Vergecast. And you think about like disruption, right? Cloudflare's not a new company, they've been around for a long time.
Yeah.
But the way that Cloudflare is now interacting with this new economy, this new token-based economy or bot-based economy, whatever you want to call it, that's a pretty interesting disruption story. So this isn't me, necessarily shilling for Cloudflare. We have no affiliation with Cloudflare outside of using Cloudflare to blot bots from scraping our data. Um, but again, like thinking about the current thing, right? And I think in the interview, Cloudflare CEO indicated that over 50% of all web traffic now is bots, and most of them are going to be LLM bots. And what does that do to traditional news sources? He talked about specifically, this is the first time in history that he has seen where you have market leaders in Amazon and Walmart taking vastly different approaches to how they're embracing or rejecting this bot traffic. Walmart says, yep, we're open for all agents. Come scrape us as much as you want. Amazon saying, oh no. And Amazon's actually successfully sued. I think it was Perplexity for initializing these types of things. So, again, whether that's Vergecast, whether that's compound interest, whether that's identifying stories within the grander picture of things, um, I'm offering this anecdote up to some of our audience members on the PR side. It's really difficult, I think, to land a podcast guest appearance, even if you have an incredibly impressive guest, unless you're also meeting that with where the podcast premise actually exists and what's currently happening and currently trending. So, am I way off base there, Daniel?
No, I actually, that like kind of brings me to a question,
Yeah.
and it's something that I am thinking about, and it kind of goes to not necessarily search, but like clipping and people discovering through video as a first touch is just like I think YouTube for a long time has been the second largest search engine. Um, I have heard of Gen Z using TikTok as a search engine, and I imagine that other age groups will follow suit and start using that. But I'm curious of like how clipping strategies for like both podcasting like will develop over time with these. Like, is it going to favor things that are happening in the moment? Will those algorithms eventually favor evergreen content of similar to YouTube? Like you can look up how to change a light bulb. Like,
Yep.
is that going to be similar on TikTok and Instagram Reels? So that's something that I am also thinking about from an audience development perspective as we're cutting clips for the show.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I have a couple different perspectives on it. The first will be a firsthand experience I had at Podcast Movement Evolutions in Las Vegas, and I think that was 2022 or 2023. And I was sitting down with the chief revenue officer of a comedy podcast network, and one of their podcasters is someone that we've all seen. He's performed at Madison Square Garden 20 something times, etc. And I said point blank, when I go onto my Instagram feed or my TikTok feed, I follow the comedian, but 9 times out of 10, the content that I see from the comedian on my Instagram feed or my For You page, whatever we want to call it, are actually like clips that seem to be generated from some unknown, potentially botted type of account that's basically ripping all of your content and then throwing it up on their page. How do you resolve that, especially as a chief revenue officer? And his point was a lot of these accounts are created offshore or near shore or virtual shored. This is before mass adoption of AI, of course. So, remember that point in time. And they viewed it as a blessing and a curse, right? So on one side, they're not capturing that additional revenue. They're limited a little bit in terms of how much they can monetize social audiences. But on the flip side, because these I call them cloud-based accounts because no one really knows where they come from or where they live. But a lot of these cloud-based accounts are driving free distribution for the individual, for the personality, for the media company, et cetera. And if somebody actually does want to engage in a commercial deal with the talent, they still have to go through the central operation, right? Which is of course going to be the network. So if that was, 3, 4 years ago at this juncture, and we've only seen that increase with how distribution is changing, uh, I do think it was inevitable that we'd reach this point of the clipping economy.
Yeah.
And I want to talk a little bit deeper about the clipping economy because it is everywhere within the podcast industry right now. I mean, we've seen Pod News of the world, we've seen Sounds Profitable talk about clipping economy, we've seen Business Insider cover it, we've seen a
I
number
think
of
the Wall
yeah,
Street Journal had a piece today. So yeah,
even
it's very
today.
present right now.
It is, and it extends outside of just podcasts and media, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the kind of creation and further amplification of what's been called the quote unquote manosphere and kick streamers paying tens of thousands of dollars to have all of these quote unquote cloud accounts set up, and all of a sudden you can't go anywhere on the internet without seeing this guy named Clavicular. Who, I mean, what is this, right? So
Yeah.
you start to realize, how much of a synthetic existence actually lives on social media, and all of these distribution channels. But I think that the underlying point of all of that is the changing of the algorithms, and I think TikTok is largely to thank and or blame, depending on your perspective for this, and that they were really the first ones to take the algorithm and flip it on its head. So prior to that, you had news feed based content. What was populated in your news feed were shows, creators, brands, pages that you followed, and that's kind of what was delivered to you. Then someone had this genius idea, well, what if we do it based off of interests and behavior as opposed to just purely following? And I think that has allowed a lot of this to kind of, those were early days, and that's allowed it to amplify. But when we think about it, especially from an audience development perspective, like your main goal is not to increase the number of followers for the Semafor page necessarily, right? And this is where I want to throw it back to you as I get
Yeah.
off my soapbox here. Um, but like social media is a big part of audience development, of course, and you guys haven't necessarily taken like the full-fledged clipping uh, route. You have very professionally done, very well polished, very good looking clips for Reels, for Instagram, TikTok, YouTube Shorts, etc. But how are you seeing this kind of push and pull effect when it comes to short form video?
Yeah. Like as you said, they're the biggest streamers in the world, and like using clipping as part of building an audience around them, and how much of it is real, how much of it is inflated, we don't know. And I think over time we'll get that answer. But like, um, I think if it wasn't working, we wouldn't see so many people do it. So at Semafor, I think we're thinking of clipping as part of our distribution structure. Um, like TikTok, Instagram, X are no longer secondary channels. They are homes, and that is where people get their news. I think there's a Gallup poll from a few years ago that shows like half of the US adult population gets their news from social media. I don't know if there will be a day that we go back to them going to um, like a majority of them going to a news site to get their news. So I think we think about it as we have to meet the audience where they are.
Yeah.
And we have been using clipping, I think, very intentionally with the not expectation, but just the assumption that this might be someone's first time interacting with Semafor. And we want to be able to convey the same amount of intelligence and talking directly at the reader or the watcher in this case, um, as we do in our writing. Um, so I think in some way it's like to give like our newsroom and a lot of people are like journalists first and foremost to then be like, hey, you need to explain this very complicated topic on camera. Um, I've just been pretty in awe of their ability to do that in a smart way. And from our analytics, we've been able to see that people have been sticking around for a majority of the videos that we post, especially when we're doing like longer form pieces about like, for example, like the US China summit this week. But I do think like we are not like going all in on it. We just see it as a place for audience discovery, and hopefully over time, if they see enough clips um, from compound interest, that will get them to then check out the show somewhere. Um, and just two quick things of the clips, and this is new stuff that I uncovered this week when doing some reporting, is just like, and I don't know how many other guests we'll have on who are involved in sports in some ways, but like we've had one clip from Mark Valor and then also one from Mark Cuban, um, like do very well, and they weren't necessarily related to like their past lives of like owning a sports teams, if what they're doing in the current moment. Like the Mark Cuban one was focused on an industry that he would like to see disrupted next. And it was really focused on just health insurance companies in general.
Mm.
Um, and that seemed to make a lot more traction than I guess my hypothesis of like a clip of him talking about his regrets selling the Dallas Mavericks would. Um, so when we're clipping, I think we're intentionally thinking about what are people in the moment thinking about.
I think that's a really good point because there is no medium that's as fast or instantaneous as social, right? So like we think
Yeah.
about podcast being a very intentional medium. You have to literally go into your app of choice, click play on an episode, listen to it, like and that's what you've chosen to do versus the speed. I mean, I won't name names, but there are people in my family, you see their thumb at a dinner party or a Thanksgiving meal and like their thumbs are just boom, 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 and they're playing dopamine roulette or dopamine slot machine, if you will.
Yeah.
And if something doesn't capture their attention within the first 2 seconds, like that thumb, you just start to see it move. So the immediacy of social is one aspect of, I think, of why the clipping economy has grown. But the other is some of like the intersectionality that can exist, right? So when we think about, to your point, a clip of Cuban talking about his regret selling the Dallas Mavericks, we know that that's been talked about previously. And there are clips of him out there, so maybe there's not as much net new interest in that story. However, Mark Cuban's take on insurance, that is net new. And then you think about the surface area of that insurance conversation, whether that's, the tragedies that we've seen, and personal stories, obviously the Luigi Mangione trial. I mean, all of these types of things. This creates like a very interesting intersectionality of interests and looking for a trusted voice or a known voice to add their own version of what they think is wrong with that industry. And that's where I think that kind of magic can happen on social and how discovery does happen. People know Mark Cuban. Maybe they like Mark Cuban, but maybe they don't, but they're also interested in listening to him. And then you take like the insurance thing as people are seeing their premium skyrocket and all of that, and now all of a sudden you've created this new cohesion. You've bonded him to a new type of conversation, and again, that's going to happen through social. And if you want the full details, you got to go check out the full episode, right? So it is interesting. When I
And
think, and you mentioned, Gen Z and these types of things, I always bring back or recall the memories of seeing like old SNL skits circa, Y2K era where they're at a dinner party in some Upper East Side, penthouse, and the most interesting person in the room is the blogger, right? And then you fast forward that a very similar skit comes out 10 years later. The most interesting person in the world, or the quote unquote most learned person in the world, is somebody who listens to the New York Times podcast. And oh, did you hear Ezra Klein talk about X, Y, and Z? If we fast forward another 5 to 10 years, is that same SNL skit going to look like, the native Gen Z who's like, oh, did you see that clip of so and so talking about, whatever the case might be? So because
I
we've had this persistence, and it seems like every decade we kind of rewrite what the medium actually looks like. Maybe that'll happen. I don't know. But it is interesting, especially from where you sit. I'm
yeah.
sure of it.
My hope is that the most interesting person in 10 years will be listening to a Semafor podcast,
There you go.
but only time will tell.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Excellent. So as we start to wrap up here, I'm not going to ask you to give any advice to other business podcasts or anything like that, but I guess as you've had this outsized success, especially in the early going, is there anything that surprised you about the growth of the show?
Um, I think so one thing that I think was very helpful is that Liz and Rohan are topic experts, they're journalists, and our comms team has worked like with them, and they talk with other journalists in the area, but like having them go on to other shows and be a topic expert, and then also, by the way, they have this other podcast where they might talk about this, like has been a huge lever. Um, Liz has been on TBPN as of recently, which has gotten a bunch of buzz in the last 6 to 12 months. Uh, Rohan went on Prof G a few weeks ago to talk about the eBay um, GameStop like takeover and how it was priced. So I've just like hats off to them for like doing another job of like going out and talking about things and letting people know about the show. Um, I guess I could also give just two pieces of advice
Yeah.
is um, one, if you're like trying to work with another podcast, just find an email and tell them like, hey, I would love to work with you in some capacity. Everyone I have interacted with has been very friendly, and it's just a very nice community to be in. I think you mentioned Joni Deutsch earlier, and she is just always like a wealth of knowledge and willing to just talk about things she's working on. So I found connecting with other people and having conversations like this have been helpful for my role. Um, and then the last thing that I'll say is just like when you're like getting close to an episode being finished, um, like if you're able to find a contact at one of the hosting platforms, I know Pocket Cast does curation submissions every month, and you can get on an email list for that. Finding someone at Apple or submitting through their editorial discovery form and talking with someone at Spotify, that has been a huge help and it's a really good exercise, I think, for an audience perspective of like how well do I know this episode? Like
Mm.
I need to write about it. Why like it really makes me beg the question of like is the episode interesting? And like most of the time it is, and I'm able to like work it and submit pitches. But that's a really good way of getting to know the product as it continues to evolve over time.
Yeah, very sound advice.
Yeah.
And I do want to double back real quick to TBPN because when we started publishing the data and showing that, this is the first time since 2024, I did receive a couple questions from folks saying like, well, I just saw TBPN was acquired for whatever it was, $100 million by OpenAI. I think that was, yeah,
The low hundreds of millions is
low
the Wall
hundreds
Street
of
Journal
millions.
reported.
And
Yeah.
I said, well, surely TBPN got out like gangbusters with their show. And the answer is actually no, unless you were like a tech bro or came from like the tech sphere, you probably didn't really know who TBPN was until you saw those headlines from the OpenAI acquisition. And what's interesting is a friend of mine runs a meme software company, and he pitched me the idea of writing a guest article on the Podchaser blog. I think it was December of 2023, maybe early 2024, and he was telling me about this show that has basically started to build their audience by using memes. And his name is Jason Levin, and sure enough, it ends up being Jordy and John,
Yeah.
and we've had an increase in traffic to that page specifically as people are Googling TBPN podcasts. They see, oh, wait a second, these guys were kind of started the clipping movement, at least in B2B podcasts, and they were using memes to grow, on social media that built a bridge from social media to their clips to the long form content, live content, mind you. And there's, I think that's an interesting case study, in that they didn't start out of the gate really strong. Obviously, both Jody and John have very significant audiences. They've done some really incredible things in their careers, but like they had to start from the ground up. They didn't have this network of newsletters and podcasts to work with, maybe the same way as Semafor did. So I think if there is any hope for quote unquote independent podcasters in the space, like you can brute force your way into the zeitgeist. It's just
Yeah.
it takes a lot longer.
I think that, I mean, uh, is it John Coogan?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he had a YouTube channel that was particularly successful, and they both
Yep.
had like I think he had sold a few companies. Soylent is one of them, I think.
Yep. Soylent.
But yeah, they have done an incredible job. And pre-acquisition, I was also just impressed with their ability to work with brand. And like when they were acquired by OpenAI, I saw a bunch of people on my X feed being like, "We missed the ticker of like all of the brand sponsoring,"
Yeah.
and they got someone to sponsor a gong. Like they were very smart about picking the right advertisers and finding unique ways to work with them that both speak to the audience that they're very focused on reaching. Um, and I get that's who those brands want. So yeah, kudos to them. I'm
Yeah.
excited to see where they are in the next year or 2 years. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the one interesting thing, and I'm just going to offer this up as a juxtaposition of how Semaphore is approaching compound interest and maybe some of your other business content is because of TBPN's success, we have seen lookalikes or copycats, if you will. MTS is one. I just came across another one today. I mean, it looks basically like SportsCenter or CNBC, but for business podcasts. And I think because we do live in a copycat world, the mimetic desire of us all, hey, I want to be a good-looking tech guy and talk about random business things on a podcast. I think we're going to start to see more and more uh, of that style of podcast, if we want to call it that.
Derek Thompson, formerly of The Atlantic,
Yeah.
and has a great essay from last year about how everything is turning into television, of like
Yes.
what television used to be. And I feel like these shows like Pat McAfee for
Yep.
sports, TBPN, MTS, like
Yep.
it's, I mean, uh, like I guess where do we go from here? Is it just news, or like will we get some of these shows that are more produced every day that focus on like a true crime or
Yep.
like science? Yeah, I imagine we probably will see some test runs of that if we've already seen it quite a bit.
Well, let me pitch you on this then. It's a true crime podcast, and along the bottom scroll and the right rail, we're getting live crime updates from from various municipalities.
So it's like a riffing to then come up with true crime based on what's going on in the world.
Exactly, exactly. No, I kid. That's in total jest. But I do think as you start to see the pendulum swing maybe towards the TV-ification of content, I think what you're also going to see is this pendulum swing backward towards more of the compound interest style content, in my opinion, because it is a stark difference, I believe, in the types of audiences you're attracting. And there has to be balance, right? Like we can't all swing one way, otherwise, we end up in this kind of mass delusion of what content actually is. So I give you guys a ton of credit and the
Thank you.
Semaphore team generally for going out there and doing this. So again, congratulations
Thank
to you,
you.
congratulations to the team. I really appreciate the insights you've been able to share with us here today, Daniel.
Yeah, yeah, thank you for having me, Trent. This has been fun, and
Yeah.
yeah, we should do it again.
Yeah, yeah. So hey, for everybody who's listening, whether it's now or on the replay, go check out Compound Interest on your uh, podcast app of choice. And thanks again to Daniel for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you guys. All right,
Cheers,
talk later.
guys.